Welcome everyone. Today we have our another new episode and we have our world famous speaker, Professor Rob, Professor David Smith and Mr. Marshall. Our topic is disinformation detections and corrections, many things happening in the online, and we have our technology expert. They will analyze the topic. Professor Rob.
Sure. Disinformation is generally referred to as a process whereby somebody is putting out propaganda, for the most part, carrying a certain amount of truth, but designed to create a false reality that's very different than the one we exist in. The places you see it most often is in governments. Large industries. Tobacco was rather famous for their disinformation campaign that went on for decades with regard to the health or lack of health for cigarettes. Same thing with the petrochemical industry that put out disinformation on global warming for a long period of time and set back those efforts decades. So efforts to combat global warming decades. The way you combat disinformation is by validating or discrediting the source. As we've seen in the recent war in Ukraine, Russia has been putting out a substantial amount of disinformation, and to varying degrees of success, the social media companies have been identifying the Russian actors and eliminating them, taking them off their platforms. But like any good government, or I should say, use the word good there, but competent effort, that they've got multiple sources of being able to supply that disinformation, and it's become a little bit like whack-a-mole. But the predominant way is if you see a piece of information that comes through and it seems to speak to the way that you believe, you don't feel like you need to challenge it, that's precisely the time you need to go back and just double check the source. Because that's how disinformation works. It embeds a little bit of truth. It tries to tell you what it is you want to hear, and then wraps around the message of false dialectic, so that you become convinced. So you convince yourself that what is false is in fact true. And what you've got to do is break that cycle. You have to make sure that you are not contributing to that false information, either by spreading it or by accepting it unchallenged. The two things you can do is first recognize how disinformation works. It works by tuning you against yourself, and also understanding that the source is critical, and that if the source can't be trusted, the information can't be trusted, even if it looks appealing to you. By following those two practices, you can do a great deal to reducing the amount of disinformation that's out there, and even more important, reducing the number of times you are fooled through disinformation.
Thank you, Professor Rob. Professor David Smith.
Rob always does an excellent job of sitting out the topic, and the role of disinformation has gone back for centuries, really, and it's not just a digital phenomenon. During World War II, the United States and other countries, for example, made cardboard tanks and put them in the field, and had the enemy see them as real tanks, and you saw things like that actually throughout history, that this concept has been used. To me, as I look at the whole area of disinformation, there's a couple of things that kind of take me back of it, because to me, disinformation is false information deliberately. And this next part, I believe, is really very important, often covertly spread to influence public opinion or to obscure the truth. And so disinformation and misinformation are similar, but the intent is very different when you look at the two. In most militaries and most intelligence agencies, there's whole departments and groups and dedicated to looking at how to shape information to your adversaries, to your troops and others. And so it's not just a concept where you go do it. It actually has some art and science to it as well. There are what is really different in today with the whole concept of disinformation is that many of the places today where we get our information are black boxes in nature. So most of today's most widely used platforms make it hard for us to understand where the information is coming from, how the algorithms are changing it, how they're affecting both legitimate and illegitimate information that's coming out. And human nature says, if I see it, I believe it. And we have to begin to go back and to one of the Reaganisms that I thought was a good one way back then. It was trust but verify. And I believe that trust but verify is an important part of where we need to head in today's world as we get there. Yeah, many people think the term disinformation actually is a literal translation from Russian term, which I'm not going to try to pronounce it right now, but it was a term that the KGB used to create a department to really disperse propaganda. And this was back in the early 50s, but I think it was, like I said, even used well before that. And you see the use. We've seen it in elections. Of course, you see it in the fog of war. We've seen it, as Rob talked about, with large companies, small companies. It's just a character of our time. But the biggest thing today is because so many of our news sources have become black box. It's hard to really do it, because if I look at Facebook, if I looked at Twitter, if I looked at Instagram and others like that, Snapchat, they're all black boxes. And I could put a tweak out to my 10,000 or so subscribers to my Twitter account and say the world is black and white now and there's no longer color. A small percentage of them would believe that. And so we have to be careful as we begin to go down this path. It's part of the current reality and the extremes. I mean, I can now do computer generated faces that more people will identify as actual faces than the actual faces themselves. So that's kind of where we are with disinformation, and it's one that we have to be diligent with. And like I said, I love the Reaganism, trust but verify, when it comes to this. So, Sharif?
Thank you, Mr. Marshall.
Thank you, Sharif. It's hard to follow on what both Rob and David have enumerated. A lot of this information that they're sharing is not disinformation or misinformation. It's accurate information. I find it quite ironic that you picked, Sharif, today's topic because of what's going on currently in the Ukraine and with the Russian so-called military, from the Russian point of view, the military operation. They don't call it an invasion. They made sure that all the Russian population is only seeing what their media wants to see. And this has been traditional, as David and both Rob have pointed out, throughout history. And it actually, and David is correct, the term that he was referring to was a Russian term, disinformatia, which was created by the KGB in the 50s. And it was a term of art for them to actually go ahead and do certain things. So it's true that was the case. But I'll point out that, as David pointed out, this has been around a long time. It's not created because of being able to send misinformation through social media or disinformation through social media, as we've seen recently in the last few years. But it's been around a long time. And to give you another classic example of it, in the war between Texas and Mexico in the 30s. This is before the United States invaded Mexico to attack Santa Anna, and his troops who tried to take over parts of the southwest of the United States, or controlled southwest of the United States. The United States, the Texans who fought for independence against Mexico and Santa Anna were able to fight off the Santa Anna and the Mexicans by using their media. They had literally, this is really amazing. They had over 600 newspapers throughout Texas at that time. That's a lot of newspapers for the 1830s. And they were distributing the newspapers not just in the local community, but in a lot of outreaching areas, which surprised me. What I found to be very fascinating is that a lot of these articles, if you read them, have a lot of disinformation in them on purpose. It's purposeful. You can tell it is. Though I think people over time, if they're not exposed to it, there's a certain naivete about reading this information. But once you get a handle of it and you have a certain level of education, you can grasp the meaning of this. So I think, as Jason Greger is pointing out, it is a big problem today, and we're seeing it firsthand in front of us through Putin's use of disinformation for the rest of the world. Unfortunately for him, most people outside of Russia just don't believe it. And if you notice the elements that are supporting him, they're not supporting him equivocally unless he's got them really by the throat, and that would be Belarus. The Chinese government, obviously, they're the biggest trading partner with Russia, so they have a self-interest in maintaining a relationship, but they even are not unequivocal about supporting their disinformation campaign or their perception of truth. Quite interestingly enough, by the way, during the communist era, when Putin was a KGB officer, by the way, and was trained tactically on how to implement tactics, not necessarily strategy, the Russian newspaper that was the most widely used for disinformation was called Pravda. And even its name was disinformation, because Pravda in Russian is the word truth. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Edward.
Hi, thanks a lot. I can only stay on for a little bit here, but I certainly associate myself with Rob and David's comments and Marshall's as well. But I want to make a couple of points that have concerned me, and that's that over time, when governments have an institutional interest in producing a certain narrative because they have, again, a government agency has institutional interests, they need to find problems to solve if they want to keep their budgets up and so forth. Then you get a problem with disinformation coming from that source. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples here. For example, I think that over time in the 1950s and 60s, it became indisputable that tobacco smoking caused a whole plethora of illnesses, cancer, of course, emphysema, you can go down the list. There's no question about that. What the government should do about it is a separate question. But then what you've seen in recent years is our Environmental Protection Agency, or not Environmental Protection Agency, sorry, our Food and Drug Administration, demonizing vaping as just as bad as cigarette smoking. I've got a whole list here. I was going to read some of them to you of citations showing that vaping is a good way to transition from more dangerous smoking, because it's the burning of the tobacco that causes most of the problems, to something that's less dangerous. Not that I'm advocating it, by the way, but the Royal Society of Britain, I have a whole thing of citations here showing that it's a good way to do tobacco harm reduction. A lot of countries, Sweden, for example, are doing this. And yet we see that our Food and Drug Administration essentially is demonizing and basically saying, no, it's just as bad as smoking tobacco as in a cigarette. So should I trust our Food and Drug Administration? They have an institutional interest in doing this. And again, it's sad because it's one of the citations is something like 3 million people have gotten off of cigarette tobacco, which is much more harmful, because they've been able to transition to vaping. So there's a public health issue. You see the same thing with environment. There's no question that 50, 60 years ago, that when a company dumps industrial waste into a river, it does demonstrable harm to human beings. But for example, in recent decades, because government agencies want to justify their existence, they have a thing called brownfields requirements. So let's say in the middle of a city, there's a field that's been used for some thing. They have, if I want to come in and I want to put a garage there, I have to clean up the soil so clean that basically, I think that the thing is that a child can eat several spoonfuls of dirt over a period of many, many years and not get sick. Literally, that's the standard. Now, it makes a difference between I'm putting a playground there or I'm putting a garage there. And yet it's the same standard. And the EPA basically says, well, no, this is the science. The science is that it's, so you've gone from really doing something, you know, with science that shows that the environment is harmed, we have to do something, to something that's kind of made up. Climate's another example of where there are serious issues. But for example, the Environmental Protection Agency, this is a graph, basically has gone back and adjusted century-old data. And the top thing here is basically what the raw data shows. The bottom thing, they adjusted the data down when it looks like it's a bigger curve. And when you ask the EPA, well, why exactly did you do that? Is this real science? Well, they give some excuses. And then when you ask where they got their calculations, they say, well, we can't be transparent because we got it from private companies and it's protected data. So should I believe EPA on things like this? Or for example, a friend of mine, Roy Spencer, who was the chief climatologist at NASA Huntsville, okay, has been tracking satellite data for climate change for over 40 years. This is a graph from 1979 to today. And you see there's clearly warming, no question about it, right? Though it's about half as much as is predicted by the United Nations. What's interesting is that Roy recently had his Google ad thing canceled with a note that every time he puts this up, it says unreliable and harmful claims. Okay. This is a scientist who does this as a living. He was the chief climatologist at Huntsville. He still does this at University of Alabama, Huntsville. And Google has basically said this is unreliable and harmful claims. And they have 10 scientists go over this material. No, I'm just putting this stuff out. The point is this. I believe in science as a process of discovering information. And what I worry about is that how can you tell the disinformation put out by a government agency that might be well-meaning versus the real stuff that I want to know? I want to know the real stuff about COVID. I have a friend of mine who worked at the National Institutes of Health just down the street here, a physicist and a scientist looking at this stuff. And when he posted some material on Facebook, not anti-vaping stuff or vaccine stuff, but just some information he had about some of the processes of the vaccines, it was taken down because it was said unreliable. My point is this. I absolutely take what my fellow panelists here have said about disinformation in many areas, but I warn that we need to be very careful. I think the answer to disinformation is more information and more debate. I'll give you one final example here because I got to get off. There's a community bulletin board that everybody in my county posts on about, you know, it could be anything from schools to crime to whatever it is you want to know. And a couple of people got kicked off of this board for putting up so-called misleading information about COVID. Now, I have all my vaccines. I wear a mask. I do all those kind of things. And so I posted on the board that the best way to refute disinformation is to present real information. And I wanted to do that. I wanted to have these people who make these claims that I disagree with, put out their information. And I'll say, here's why it's wrong. Blah, 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 blah. I was censored and my thing was taken down for saying that we shouldn't censor information. The point is this. I think that the best way to go after disinformation is with real good information. Now, I also appreciate, as my fellow panelists have said, the institutional issues involved with that, and how do you do it? But David, you stole my line here. Actually, you stole Ronald Reagan's line, and I completely agree with that. Trust but verify. Sharif, should any of your listeners believe anything I say? And the answer is no, they shouldn't. They should take what I say and say, that's very interesting what Ed says. Is Ed nuts, or is Ed half right or wholly right? I don't know. I want to look into it myself. And that's the most important thing I think about our education system, is we have to get back to training folks in critical thinking and being able to analyze data and be able to look at, well, is this real? What is the context for this data? Where does it come from? Whenever I see a claim, I usually try to work back. And as Rob said, you're looking for, what is the source of it? Is it some wacko's blog, or is it, here are 10 studies that we've looked at. So the thing is, I warn that government, unfortunately, often is part of the problem rather than part of the solution. I'm going to have to pop off in a few minutes, but anyway, that's my take. Thanks, Sharif,
Thank you.
for a very important topic.
Thank you. Professor Rob, specifically in this COVID-19 situation, as well as now actually Europe has unrest, Russia and Ukraine issues. So lot of informations in social media. Lot of information comes from media. So actually, specifically when we work with different communities and cultural people, not only online, even offline. Today, we start working with around 3,000 mosques. They have a lot of students in Malaysia. But this youth community, they are actually confused. They have now even their mentor, their teachers, everybody, they are concerned that how they can develop the next generations. Lot of information, they lost their reading habits, as well as lot of misinformation comings. What is, like, not only Mr. Rob, all of the speakers advise, because I believe in the offline we are observing many education institutions, they are suffering for this kind of disinformations and different things. So what is your advice, Professor Rob?
Well, it's not just the youth. I mean, we're all suffering through massive amounts of disinformation that is causing us to make decisions that aren't in our best interests. Political parties do this on a regular basis. They convince you to vote for something that probably works against the group that you belong to, because their goal is to get your vote. Their goal isn't to provide the truth. Walt Mossberg put up a few weeks back, put up a set of rules. Walt and I go way back, not exactly friends. I used to do the radio version of his column, and he was convinced I was after his job, which I wasn't. But that doesn't mean he isn't a decent reporter when he steps up to it. And his advice, I think, is to point. What says, when you get a piece of information, a particular piece of information that looks too good to be true, and first do a quick search, see who corroborates it. Who backs up that piece of information? As Edward said, is it just a bunch of fringe sites, or is it backed up by actual news organizations that have some rigor behind their news coverage? And even looking at news organizations, is it being forwarded by the entertainment side, the opinion side of the news organization, or is it being forwarded by the hard news side of the organization? Because it actually makes a difference these days. Look for standards. If you're reading a particular article, what are the standards the site has? What rules do they hold themselves to? And when you're looking at standards, of course, you've got to ask yourself, how transparent are they with regard to enforcement of those standards? Do they explain how they deal with things? For instance, how do they deal with errors? If the organization never seems to make a mistake, or at least it never acknowledges a mistake, because everybody does make mistakes, it's probably a news source that you should distrust. Nobody's 100% accurate all the time. So look at how they handle errors and whether they report them. Assess the coverage the site has. Often, when I'm looking at a site, it's very clear that the site may be biased one way or the other. That bias has to impact how I use the information they're providing. because that bias will flow through whatever it is that I'm forwarding. And so I want to know, are they being honest with me, or do they have an agenda? And if they've got an agenda that's going to discredit the information they have that applies to that agenda, they could be perfectly accurate with regard to something that is not tied to their political focus, while still being very inaccurate with regard to something that is tied to their political focus. The kinds of things you want to really look for is false or untrue content. If a site consistently has or is being called out for false or untrue content, it needs to be avoided. Look for sites or avoid sites that focus on clickbait. Headlines that grab your attention, but when you get into the article, they have really nothing to do with the headline. That's a waste of your time. And once again, if you forward it without reading the piece, you're embarrassing yourself in the process and discrediting your own information, which is good in any way, shape, or form, particularly if it comes through your work environment. I mentioned before lack of balance. Sites that just consistently say a particular side of the argument and don't even discuss that there is another side. Those are sites that probably should be avoided. Sites that manipulate video or images. Yeah, on a satire site, that's going to happen quite a bit, but just recognize it's satire. It's not news. And often these days, it's really hard to tell the difference because some of the news we get looks like satire and it's actually true. State-run or state-sponsored sites. A site that's sponsored by a state, any state, is going to have an agenda. It may be accurate with respect to some things, but very inaccurate with respect to others. And being able to tell the difference can become impossible. So I'm not a big fan of state-sponsored sites unless it has to do with health and safety. The health and safety stuff, I tend to do follow state sites for that. But when you get outside of health and safety, you do worry about the political agendas, particularly if you don't have an open and free press in the environment in which the site exists. And then dangerous, offensive, or malicious content. If a site is consistently drifting across the line into personal attack, then you're probably better off looking for your news coverage someplace else. Once again, it showcases an agenda. That agenda may not align with your own and certainly may not align with the truth. The thing is the big problem with disinformation is often, particularly in governments, the government begins to believe it. And I think that's what we're seeing with the Russian-Ukraine conflict at the moment. It does appear like leadership in Russia has isolated itself from the facts, and it's proceeding on what at least appears to me to be a disastrous course of action for the country of Russia. But it's very clear their leadership doesn't see this at all. Disinformation can create a feedback loop where the people making the decisions don't recognize the fact that they are believing the disinformation they're putting out. And that's incredibly dangerous. I've seen that happen inside companies. For instance, IBM's collapse in the late 1980s, and I wrote one of the definitive papers on that while I was at IBM, was largely due to the fact that the CEO's office was surrounded by people that wanted to feed the CEO the information they thought he wanted to hear and didn't want to feed him bad news. And so he was absolutely blindsided when IBM started to fail, because nobody had shared with him the information that he needed to have to prevent the failure. And John Akers, who's the CEO at the time, was actually on paper one of the strongest CEOs that IBM had, but he was destroyed by practices that had been put in place before he took the job that isolated him from the truth and surrounded him with disinformation so he couldn't act appropriately. Disinformation is a company killer. It's a state killer as well. And I think we're seeing that play out right now in Russia. So be aware that disinformation is incredibly damaging and most damaging to the people that put it out and then turn around and believe it. At the very least, the people making the decisions, putting out the disinformation, should understand the difference between what they're doing and the absolute truth. Otherwise, they're going to make disastrous decisions for the state, and for themselves. As I say, I think we're seeing play out in Russia.
Thank you. Professor David Smith, I believe you want to share some views.
Yeah, the slide you brought up is actually a real slide taken out of a handbook on how to do disinformation. And you can kind of see if you're the person who wants to distribute the disinformation, you're the threat actor. You analyze where the cracks are, the target audience, the information environment. You weaponize it, and weaponizing is just get your messaging right, uh, get your computer infrastructure, the environment, and activate different personifications. I'm amazed at some of the personifications we see used in disinformation campaigns. Then you launch it, you fertilize it. Because what you want to do is you don't want to put one message out, you want to have it shared, you want to have it retweeted, you want to have many accounts distributed. Then you amplify, you watch it grow and watch other people do it. I love the term in the middle, useful idiots. And in many disinformation campaigns, that is where you see it used. And as it begins to grow and you watch it grow, then you have authoritative voices come in and say, I've seen this so many times, it has to be true. Then you manipulate it and then you harvest it, you take the actions on it. And understanding this is the chain of how you produce disinformation. It helps you understand some of the things like what Rob was talking about and others on how you can go back and combat it. I mean, with some things you do in a response to these, you have to go back and challenge the author. In military terms, you actually go back and hit the author, but in many places, you have to go back and challenge the author and understand what it is. You have to hold them accountable. On social media platforms, you use the platforms. You complain enough to see it can be taken down. You share signatures of disinformation campaigns from the other platforms. Uh, in academics, you have to really look across the environments. Academia is one of the most fertile environments, and I hate to say this, for disseminating disinformation. And we've seen that over the decades and decades of it. Uh, if I'm a part of a disinformation campaign, I'm going to see if I can go and use it. I'm going to use the term hit the technology. I'm going to see what technology responses I can. Can I put up filters? Now, I have
Yeah.
built some filters to block some of the disinformation coming into my channels, and it goes straight from the filter into my trash bin. So, I can use technology as part of it. You can build resilience, and resilience is both in the government, in academia, on the social media platforms, on the news media platforms, and actually the consumers of the information as well. And you have to begin to look at ways to uh, go back and respond to it, and discovery collections, uh, and I have to go back. It's my responsibility to try to verify, particularly the outlandish information I see. And when I see things, for example, that scare me in statements, I will go and find multiple sources and not multiple connected sources. Uh, if you were to see my browser right now, you're going to see about a dozen Twitter feeds opened up on the top of my browser from individuals. You're going to see in Telegram, probably half a dozen Telegram accounts opened up of people I trust. And they are getting me, I think, pretty good information with it. But what we're seeing in Ukraine right now, Sharif, is we're seeing the biggest differential to disinformation campaigns that we've seen in our lifetime. What is it? We have so many citizens with their cameras in their mobile devices shooting real video of what's happening and post it. And we're seeing that in many instances in real time. That is going to be one of the things that will help us when we go back and do the post-mortem of the disinformation campaigns around this invasion, around this war. It will help us understand our nuances to it, because we've never had that type of citizens real-time video to document what's going on. And there's people claiming war crimes are being committed. Well, if we look at some of the video, it sure appears like that. Instead of trying to come back months after the fact and do forensics to put the material together, we're seeing some things in real time. So this war is resetting the standards of disinformation and how we can combat disinformation. So Sharif, I know that was a long answer, but to me, it really helps you understand what's going on and how we can combat against it.
Thank you, Mr. Marshall.
Thank you, Sharif. That was David. Thanks for that that slide. I think that's an important slide to show to people. Basically, before Ed leaves the meeting, I just wanted to share something that I'm in agreement with him about what's going on with climate change, because I'm directly involved in that. And there's a lot of science information, and there's a lot of disinformation plus misinformation. And the difference between disinformation, as was pointed out earlier, I believe by Rob at the beginning, was that disinformation is intentional. Misinformation is just you think one thing and you say it, and it's not true, and you don't know, but it's intention. So going back to what Ed said about climate change and his friend, the scientist, I think what we need to look at is the IPCC just issued a report on climate change, and a lot of people are trashing it. And you have to look at who are the people that are trashing that report and where are they getting their data from, and what data is true and what data is not. And it's like Ed says, you got to check it out. You got to go to the source, just like anybody else, and you got to trust and verify. You have to verify the information. We're doing that as we speak. The latest IPCC report is over 3,000 pages. I've already read the first two reports, which are much shorter. One is the policy summary, and the other one is scientific background data. And the large one actually has tremendous amount of data in it. And the question is, did the IPCC use true data, or is it using information that is falsely sourced, and did they do it on purpose? That's what they're being accused of by some people. In COP26, which was the big meeting on the climate crisis, sponsored by the IPCC and the UN back in November of 2021, if you just look at who attended, obviously it was held in Glasgow, Scotland. So the largest population of citizens attending it were from Scotland and the UK. The next largest population were U.S. government entities and not NGOs, and so U.S. citizens. The third largest, which surprised a lot of people, were Chinese citizens and representing the Chinese government and their entities. The fourth largest, which is quite surprising, wasn't even a government. It was what we call lobbyists that represented big oil, big coal, big agriculture, and big chemical. And they all flashed around a lot of cash. And so what happened is it influenced the statements of people that made statements post COP26 of when they were going to get to net zero. And if we go to net zero by 2060, 2050, even 2040, it's too little too late based upon climate change science, not necessarily temperature change in temperature, but on what's happening, the amount of GHG emissions going into the atmosphere, the amount of soil degradation, and the problem with water. To give you a classic example of what David just brought up in his image that he put up there, that flow chart, what we can see and what he pointed out is you can actually take living images right away and not doctor them, and you'll see what the truth is on water. Right now, most people are not aware of this, but we're aware of it because we're working on it. We have a solution for it, is that there is a tremendous amount of proliferation of what is called harmful algal blooms and toxic algal blooms. Those are caused by a tremendous amount of usage of NPK, that's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which makes up a chemical fertilizer that is distributed through bioswales and into the land and ends up in water bodies. There was a recent NASA satellite that was not doctored. We know that because we saw it live, of Lake Superior, one of the Great Lakes in over Michigan and Wisconsin and in southern Canada. And you can actually see the harmful algal blooms. And the harmful algal blooms create this algae type covering, and it's caused by eutrophication. Eutrophication is not disinformation, it's a scientific fact. Eutrophication is the lack of oxygen in water, and that causes the death of plants and fish in the water and the biome. So this is something that is happening, and we can argue whether or not the climate change is going to go up by 1.5 degrees centigrade, or is it going to reach 1.8 or 2 or whatever. The issue is there is a real problem out there, and we have to acknowledge that first and foremost, and then combat the disinformation. And I agree with Ed that if somebody posts something that they've been tracking for 20 years on the climate, the temperature, and it shows that it's lower than what the current science, other scientists are showing, we need to question that. We need to question both. We need to see what is the real science, what are the real facts, because math is math. 2 + 2 is never 3, unless you want to believe it. Of course, the Stalinists would have you believe it back in the 50s in that disinformatia approach. And so essentially, I would say that the spread of disinformation is very, it can be complex, like what David showed, but it's kind of like people make covert press placements. We see that on social media. We saw that in the last election, 2020, and then the disinformation about that Biden was not president. And then we saw articles and stories published in sympathetic papers and media, especially social media. And Facebook was used by people to place false messages. And then it's replayed by wire services, state media, like in Russia, and also social media platforms, or their social media platforms are blocked, as they are now in Russia. And then they're picked up by mainstream media, let's say like in the US. And what happens is people are getting the wrong information. And I agree with everybody in this panel. If you want to combat disinformation, you need to actually expose the disinformation and have a discussion, a coherent discussion, and look at the science where it is. That's what we're trying to do. So my point is that truth will out is an old expression. And I'm not talking about Pravda, the Soviet version of truth. We're talking about here that that in the end, if people of like-minded intent take their faculties and look, as David and Rob and Ed have all expressed, they look at what is going on in the world and they challenge it. When you challenge it, you can verify whether it's truth or fiction. And that is what needs to be done. So it's that old expression. And I don't believe it. I think it was Reagan's Secretary of State that actually came up with the concept trust and verify.
Trust and verify.
Yeah. So that's my approach, and I agree that this is an important piece of information. Important piece topic that you brought, Sharif, to the topic, especially today, and especially over the last few hours, the next few hours that we're going to see, when critical lives will be lost and a lot of disinformation will be disseminated, and we need to validate and verify. And the good news is, as David pointed out, a lot of people have cameras with, just like you have social media that can be used to lie to people, you also have tools at your disposal to show the truth and expose it through cameras and video. Of course, that can be doctored too, but if you post it right away, it's really hard to do that, although there are algorithms that are beginning to be developed by these entities to try to overcome that and continue to post the disinformation. So I think, again, the watchword is trust but verify. There you go.
Thank you. Professor Edward.
Yeah, I've got to get off after my comments. So these are kind of my closing comments as well as everything else. A couple of things. Yeah, I want to have a discussion about climate. We probably have disagreements about it, but the point is to look at it and to look at it in full context. You know, the 1990 UN report predicted 3 degrees rise per century. The 2014 predicted 2 degrees. Roy Spencer's has kept track of it since 1979. He said it's about 1.3 or 1.4. So fine, let's discuss about what that means. And is that any different from what's been happening for the last century and a half since the end of the little ice age? By the way, it's interesting. You mentioned the thing about the blooms and the algae. I edited a paper a while ago looking at biofuels and looking what happened when you've got a lot more nitrogen poured into the Mississippi River and going down the river, which caused actual, real, measurable environmental problems because they were saying, hey, we've got these great renewable fuels, but the results of the great renewable fuels were serious environmental damage. So you have to put all of these things in the full context. But I'll mention 2 other sort of things to frame my final remarks. I agree with everybody on the importance of looking at your sources, including, you know, not just industry, but for example, in this country, and I know right here where I'm sitting in this county, we get huge subsidies if we use solar. And I mean, that's cool. I'd like to be able to afford some solar on my house, and I'm hoping Elon will get his wall down so that I can have a couple of those here. But you know, you have to look at these things. My career, going back to the late 80s, has been a lot of times editing research papers, not only doing them, but editing. I held up this thing from a paper that I actually had to edit a couple of years ago. And I looked up every single source that the writer gave me. And I said, can you really say this? Well, okay, here's the source for the, the Royal Society of Britain. This is what they say. I had a paper, somebody wrote in the paper that there's no really good evidence that fracking causes any major problems. I said, do you have sources on this? They gave me 15 sources from a variety of places, including Harvard, EPA, et cetera. It was across the board. I read the source. I said, okay, you made your point. We can publish this paper. The best thing that they had there's some little earthquakey things that are very, very small, et cetera. The point is I've spent my career, looking at authors and saying, come on, guys, show me where you can get this information. And, and a lot of times I basically said, nope, we can't publish that. You say that if we get rid of all nuclear and all fossil fuels, the windmills and the solar will cover half the area of the United States. Show me where that happens. They couldn't. And I did the calculations myself. And I actually said, well, they would cover California, Oregon, Nevada, Arizona, and part of Washington State. You can say that, but you can't say any of the other stuff. But one of the problems we do have is, as they say, education. Because we have an information saturated society, it really is difficult for the average person to separate the good data from the bad data and to put it in. I work on problems in less developed neighborhoods, and you'll see the camera of George Floyd being murdered by a speaking cop. Okay. And this is absolutely something that you have to work on. You had a situation in Baltimore City up the road here, similarly about 3-4 years ago. But you have like 20,000 murders in the United States. So there's something that yes, we should focus on a couple dozen murders by bad cops. But what about the other, 19,500? Maybe we should focus on those as well. So the point is that a visual picture gets everybody upset and they put lawn signs on their lawn and so forth. But I say, let's make sure you put this in context so that we deal with the real underlying problems. And so that's my point. This is a very important information. Knowledge is power. We have to, I think we have to have a better education system where we teach critical thinking, we teach skepticism. And so I'll just end by, again, echoing Ronald Reagan or whoever said it, trust but verify, folks. I've got to go trust and verify some other folks now. So thank you very much to my colleagues.
Thank you.
Always a great discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Rob, what's your concluding remarks for today?
Information isn't good or bad; it just is. What it can be is it can be false, and whether it's false by intent or false through ignorance, if decisions are made on that information, those decisions will be bad decisions. And the goal is to make sure that the information that you make your decisions on is well founded. We've talked a bit about, probably a bit too much about global climate change, but the fact is there are things that are going on in the world that will affect your future, of your children's future, and the future of your nation, city, or town, and you're going to be asked to react to that information. If you validate that information, if you make sure the information that you share and spread is accurate, you won't be doing damage, and you're more likely not only to make better decisions yourself, the people you send that information to are more likely to make better decisions for themselves. Using information as a weapon is, I think, very dangerous. And I think we're seeing that play out in Russia today, because there's a real danger that the people putting out the disinformation are actually beginning to believe it. And that's one of those very dangerous loops that can cause problems and serious problems that we're seeing in the Ukraine. So the goal is to make sure that the information that you use to make your own decisions is accurate, not just favorable to how you believe, but accurate. If you're wrong, you need to know you were wrong before you make a really bad decision. And the real danger here is we like the information that agrees with our worldview. We dislike the information that does not. What we need to change we need to change that dynamic and try to be accurate whenever possible, regardless of how it affects our preconceived notions. The object of our life should be to make decisions smarter, not make decisions that are more consistent. Consistency is nice, accuracy is better. So as you improve your own ability to source out accuracy, you'll not only improve your own decisions, but as you spread that information, resulting information, you'll improve the decisions of others, and that should be a personal goal.
Thank you. Professor David Smith, what's your concluding remarks for today?
Sharif, great topic for today. We can see so many applications in our recent past as well. It reminds me of something I saw last night and this morning. It was totally disrupted. The attack yesterday against the government building in Ukraine. Russia came out and said it was the Ukrainians who attacked their own building, and they were doing it for a false flag. But yet there are several cell phone pictures of the building being impacted, and a couple of them you actually see the cruise missile right before the impact, and impacts later on in it with the videos and stuff. That cruise missile, Ukraine doesn't have one like it, and it exactly matches a model of one of the Russian cruise missiles. So here's a place where a central government is using disinformation to say, no, it's not us, it's the other people doing it, and they're trying to make us look bad. But here, in today's rapid growth of all these, I hate to use the term because I don't want to insult them, citizen journalists. And it's the journalists that I worry about. But all these citizens there using their mobile devices, capturing video, capturing high resolution pictures, that in instances like this, you can tell beyond a reasonable doubt that no, it was misinformation that was, it was disinformation that was released and used there. It's going to be in events like this increasingly more difficult to do disinformation campaigns. Now, on the other hand, things around elections, things like the run up to the invasion and stuff, the disinformation campaigns of those are going to continue because you do not have visual type of information to dispute it. So we're in a time where anybody, and I do mean anybody, can do a disinformation campaign. because the world has become so digital and the digitalization has become so ubiquitous and the communications have become so ubiquitous. But I'm just going to go back to the same thing. And I know I heard Reagan say it on television, but I think you really do have to trust but verify today. And I'm telling you, I'm becoming a lot more diligent of doing that with things I see. I'll go to multiple sources to verify things that I believe are important to me. So, Sharif, thank you so much for having me on today.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Marshall, what's your concluding remarks for today?
Well, thank you, Sharif. Again, I echo what David and Rob and Ed have said, that this is a really important topic. In my concluding remarks, there's another thought that I want to share with everybody, and that is, in addition to everything that has been said about, whether it's climate change or Ukraine or vaccines or any topic, one of the things that disinformation takes into account psychologically, and I'm talking about the psychology of disinformation and not so much the use of it, obviously it's tied to the use of it, but is that the human psyche likes to hear things in a certain regard of its own nature, of its own self. So for instance, we call that assumptions. So for instance, people like to assume certain things, and if they've already got built into their worldview an assumption, then you can play to that assumption and manipulate that assumption. And that's what disinformation at its heart does. I'm not talking about misinformation, but disinformation, which is done on purpose. And as David pointed out, the video of the missile striking the government building, and of course, Putin's guys making the statement that it was them, not us. They are playing to a certain assumption to their audience. And of course, the audience, which is quite ironic when you think about it, the vast majority of the world has lined up on what side of this equation? They've lined up on the side of Ukraine, not on the side of Russia. And even China, which is a big partner financially with Russia, makes a lot of money with them and is keeping the taps open with them, is not equivocally on the side of Russia. They're unequivocal. When it came to the UN vote in the Security Council, which is binding as opposed to the General Assembly, we know that there are vetoes. The United States has a veto, Britain has a veto, Russia has a veto, France has a veto, China has a veto. All the original members of the UN have a veto. And who vetoed? Well, Russia did. But 11 voted against Russia and 1 abstained. Now, if they were so equivocal on the side of Russia, why did they abstain? Because they know they're on the fence. The vast majority of the world does not believe the disinformation that is coming out of Russia, out of the Russian Federation. And the history of it is there in that society. There are books that have been written on it. If anybody's interested, they can direct message me, and I'll share that information with them. It's easy to find on the internet. Just go to Wikipedia and look up disinformation. You can find a whole bunch of sources, and even Wikipedia can be a source of disinformation. But that's why Wikipedia uses citations, as Ed pointed out. If you use citations, you can check the citations. Doesn't mean the citation is correct. It could be correct, it could not be. But if people are lazy and they base their perceptions and their decision making upon their assumptions, we are in trouble. That's why the scientific method works, because the scientists don't just go out and make assumptions. They make assumptions, they make hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 0. And so the counter hypothesis. So they check both. And to the best of the ability that the scientists can, they demonstrate what is true and what is not true, what is accurate, what is inaccurate. So I would say, in my closing remarks here, the contribution that I would like to end with is that if you have assumptions, challenge your own assumptions about what you believe to be true. And if it turns out to be true, great. But if it turns out that it's not true, then you have to keep thinking, what are my assumptions? What are they based on? And a lot of that is based upon emotional content. Most business decisions, by the way, and governmental decisions are thought to be made on logic, pure logic. That is absolutely not a true fact. We have done lots of studies in clinical psychology studies through everything from different types of studies in social studies and social psychology, as well as other psychological behavioral psychology methods. And we've discovered that basically most people base their decisions on emotional content, not illogical content. We like to think it's logical, but it always isn't. Not always, but it can be mostly emotional content. And it might be right, it might be accurate, but it's an emotional decision as opposed to a logical decision. So on that point, thank you, Sharif, and thanks for everybody being on this panel.
Thank you everyone for joining today's sessions. Thank you. Bye-bye and take care.